In the quaint neighborhood where they'd spent decades building a life together, Eleanor and John Richards were known as the picture-perfect couple. They had grown together over 40 years of marriage, raising two children, sharing family traditions, and creating a home filled with love and familiarity. To the outside world, they were inseparable, the kind of couple others aspired to become. But recently, Eleanor had started noticing subtle changes in John. He seemed distracted, as if he were living a life in his mind she couldn't see. He spent long hours out of the house, offering vague explanations about errands or meetings with friends. Each time she questioned him, he dismissed her with a reassuring smile, yet something in his demeanor didn't feel right. At first, Eleanor tried to brush it off as a passing phase, a small quirk after years of routine. She trusted John deeply. She'd built her life on that trust. But there was a growing unease in her heart, a whisper that wouldn't quiet. The cracks were beginning to show in the foundation she had trusted all her life. One day, while sorting through papers in John's study, Eleanor found something strange. A receipt from a restaurant they'd never visited, a quaint little place tucked away on the edge of town. It wasn't unusual for John to go out for lunch, but what caught her eye was the date, their anniversary. The day he had claimed to be stuck in meetings, the night he had come home late, apologizing for forgetting the special day. A chill ran through Eleanor as she clutched the receipt, her mind racing with questions. She tried to convince herself there was a simple explanation, but the seed of doubt had been planted. As she stood there, staring at that slip of paper, Eleanor felt her world tilt ever so slightly. The life she thought she knew felt unfamiliar, as though something dark lay just beneath the surface. That night, Eleanor lay awake, watching John sleep peacefully beside her. She was gripped by the terrible feeling that something was unraveling, something far beyond a missed anniversary or a hidden lunch receipt. And as she lay in the darkness, Ellen knew that she would have to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. In the days following her discovery of the anniversary receipt, her mind churned with questions she couldn't answer. She began to pay closer attention to John's habits, watching for anything that might explain his sudden secrecy. Small things, gestures she would have once ignored, now seemed laden with hidden meaning. One afternoon, as she sat by the window sipping her tea, Eleanor noticed John across the street, talking to Margaret, their neighbor of over 20 years. Margaret had always been friendly and approachable, a staple of their family gatherings and neighborhood events. But today, as Eleanor observed them through the lace curtains, she saw something in their interaction that made her heart tighten. John's body language was subtly different, a familiarity in his posture she hadn't noticed before. Margaret's laugh seemed a little too bright, her gaze lingering on him in a way that felt almost intimate. Eleanor looked away, chastising herself for the thoughts creeping into her mind. It couldn't be. Margaret was her friend, someone she had trusted implicitly. And yet the suspicion had taken root. Eleanor knew she was watching through the lens of her growing doubt, but the nagging feeling only deepened as she recalled all the recent errands and meetings that John had excused himself for. That evening, Eleanor decided to bring up Margaret in conversation, hoping for reassurance, a simple answer that would put her mind at ease. Over dinner, she asked casually, "Have you seen much of Margaret lately? She seems to be around a lot." John paused just briefly before responding. "Oh, here and there. She's been needing help with a few things around the house, nothing major." He didn't look up as he spoke, focusing instead on his meal. Eleanor nodded, forcing a smile, but inside her heart sank. It was the first time she sensed him hiding something, even if he wouldn't admit it. She could feel it, a distance creeping into their marriage, a wall he was carefully constructing between them. As they cleared the table, Elena's resolve grew. She would keep her suspicions to herself, but she would watch closely, biding her time. She needed answers, and deep down, she knew that the truth once uncovered could change everything she believed about her life and the man she had loved for 40 years. Eleanor's suspicions continued to fester, gnawing at her thoughts throughout the day and haunting her dreams at night. She tried to suppress them, to convince herself that it was all in her imagination, that she was overreacting. But each new day seemed to bring with it more subtle signs, each one adding to the growing weight of doubt. One afternoon, as she went about tidying the house, Eleanor found herself drawn to John's study, a room he guarded fiercely, a space that had always felt off limits. Standing at the doorway, she hesitated, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Finally, unable to resist, she entered, her hands trembling as she began searching through his things. At first, she found nothing unusual, just work documents, receipts, and mundane paperwork. But then, hidden between two books on a low shelf, she found an envelope addressed in familiar handwriting. Her hand shook as she opened it, revealing a series of letters, each one filled with words of affection and longing. The letters weren't written by John, they were written by Margaret. Eleanor's breath caught as she read the words, words that spoke of secret meetings and shared memories, confessions of love, and a longing that had apparently been simmering for years. Each sentence was like a dagger to her heart, confirming the betrayal she had feared, yet desperately hoped to avoid. Her hands clenched around the letters, her mind spinning as she grappled with the enormity of what she'd uncovered. The woman she had called a friend, the neighbor who had been a part of her life for decades, had been involved in a relationship with her husband right under her nose. Stunned, Eleanor stumbled out of the study, her heart pounding as she tried to process it all. Anger, grief, and a deep sense of betrayal welled up within her, mingling with a growing, darker emotion, a desire for justice. She didn't yet know what that would look like, but as she sat alone in the quiet of the house, Ellen knew that she couldn't simply forgive and forget. This betrayal demanded consequences. That evening she confronted John with icy calm, holding the letters as undeniable proof of his deception. He stammered, grasping for excuses, but Eleanor was past listening. The life she had known was over, and in its place was a hollow shell, a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. As she looked at the man who had broken her heart and the life she had built, Eleanor felt a surge of anger she had never known before, and with it came a dark resolve. She would make sure neither John nor Margaret would ever forget the depth of their betrayal. After the confrontation, Eleanor withdrew into herself, maintaining an eerie calm that unsettled John. He tried to talk to her, to offer apologies and explanations, but she brushed him aside, her face a mask of cold detachment. Inside, however, her emotions churned like a storm, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge. The betrayal had cut so deeply that she couldn't imagine simply walking away, not without some form of justice. Over the next few days, Eleanor began to formulate a plan. She watched John carefully, observing his routines, noting the times he left the house and the hours he spent away. She even kept tabs on Margaret, noticing how she continued to go about her daily life as if nothing had happened, greeting Eleanor with forced politeness whenever they crossed paths. Eleanor's polite, friendly demeanor became a weapon, masking the bitterness boiling within her. She needed time to orchestrate her plan, and she knew that acting too hastily would ruin everything. She wanted them to feel safe, to believe that she had accepted their betrayal, even forgiven it. But she hadn't. She was only waiting for the perfect moment. One evening, as she sat in her room, Eleanor began writing in a journal, a habit she had picked up years ago, one she had abandoned somewhere along the way. In its pages, she poured out her anger, her pain, and her plans. It was a way to process everything, to give form to the rage that consumed her. Her mind drifted to thoughts of Margaret, the friend she had trusted so implicitly, who had smiled and shared meals in her home, while hiding a secret affair. The audacity of it fueled Eleanor's resolve, solidifying her determination to bring both of them to justice in a way they would never expect. Eleanor's plan became more than an idea. It became her purpose. She would reclaim the power she had lost, and she would ensure the betrayal that had broken her would haunt them forever. With her plan firmly in place, Eleanor's demeanor grew colder, more calculated. She went about her daily routines with quiet precision, carefully masking her intentions. She resumed polite conversations with John, pretending to accept his half-hearted apologies. She even invited Margaret over for tea, as though to convey an air of reconciliation. Both John and Margaret seemed relieved by her newfound calm, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. During their tea, Eleanor watched Margaret closely, studying her every movement and expression. She forced herself to smile, to listen, even as Margaret spoke in her usual warm, familiar tone, pretending as though nothing had happened. It was infuriating, but Eleanor maintained her composure, never allowing the mask to slip. As they sipped their tea, Eleanor subtly turned the conversation toward plans for the upcoming neighborhood gathering. She suggested that Margaret and join her in organizing the event, presenting the idea as a way to rekindle friendships and move past recent misunderstandings. Margaret, unsuspecting and eager to maintain her image, agreed immediately. Over the next few days, Eleanor continued her performance, drawing both John and Margaret into her plans for the gathering. She offered to host it at their home, insisting that it would be a night to remember. She made arrangements, sent out invitations, and prepared an elaborate setup, all the while masking her true intentions beneath a veil of hospitality. On the day of the gathering, Eleanor prepared a beautiful display: candles, flowers, fine tableware. She poured drinks and set out hors d'oeuvres, creating an atmosphere that radiated warmth and elegance. It was the perfect setting, inviting and welcoming, giving no hint of what lay beneath. As guests began to arrive, Eleanor moved through the crowd with practiced grace, greeting friends and neighbors, exchanging pleasantries. She watched John and Margaret from across the room, noting their ease, their obliviousness to the trap she had so carefully set. Tonight would be the night when everything would come to light, when the secrets they had so carefully hidden would be exposed in front of everyone they knew. Eleanor waited patiently, biding her time as the evening wore on. She knew that the final act would require precision, that the reveal had to be as devastating as the betrayal itself, and as the clock inched closer to the appointed hour, Eleanor felt her heart steady, her resolve hardened. She was ready to unveil the truth, to make them feel the humiliation and betrayal she had endured. Tonight, she would take back her power, and she would do it in a way that would haunt them forever. The evening unfolded with a slow, steady grace. Eleanor moved seamlessly through the crowded living room, her smile welcoming, her laughter soft and inviting. To the guests, she appeared every bit the gracious hostess she had always been, as if nothing were amiss. But beneath her calm exterior, her heart beat in anticipation. Tonight was the culmination of weeks of planning, of nights spent awake, crafting the perfect moment of reckoning. She noticed the occasional shared glance, the barely there smile Margaret would cast in John's direction when she thought no one was watching. Their subtle displays of affection, though hidden from others, were painfully obvious to Eleanor. Each look was a reminder of the deceit that had festered beneath her own roof, turning her stomach with a bitter blend of anger and betrayal. Once she had gathered everyone's attention, Eleanor tapped her glass gently, the soft chime ringing through the room, silencing the murmurs of conversation. She took a moment surveying the crowd, her gaze finally settling on John and Margaret, who stood near the center, smiling as though they were part of some grand celebration. They had no idea what was coming. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Eleanor began, her voice calm yet firm. "It means the world to me to have our friends and neighbors gathered in our home. You have all been a part of our lives, sharing in our joys and supporting us through our challenges. And tonight, I have something to share with all of you, something that's been kept hidden for far too long." A ripple of curiosity moved through the crowd. Eleanor saw John's smile waver, his brows furrowing slightly, while Margaret's expression flicked with a trace of uncertainty. She let the silence linger for a moment, letting the tension build before continuing. "For years, I believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the trust that binds two people who commit to sharing a life together." Eleanor continued, her voice growing colder with each word. "I gave my heart to a man I thought I knew, a man I trusted with everything I had. But sometimes, trust can be a dangerous thing when it's placed in the wrong hands." The room had grown silent, the air thick with an uneasy tension. Eleanor saw John's face pale, his eyes widening as he began to understand. Margaret's smile faded completely, replaced by a look of dawning horror. "Imagine my surprise," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with bitterness, "when I discovered that my husband, a man I loved for 40 years, had been sharing his heart with someone else. Not just anyone, mind you, but someone close. Someone who had woven herself into our lives, pretending to be a friend." The crowd's gaze shifted between John and Margaret, whispers rippling through the guests as realization dawned. Eleanor held up the letters, the ones she had found hidden in John's study, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. "These," she said, her hands steady as she held the stack of letters aloft, "are the love letters my husband and our dear friend Margaret exchanged in secret. A relationship conducted in shadows, a betrayal that festered in the very heart of my home, and tonight, in front of everyone, I want you both to see what it feels like to be laid bare, to be stripped of your secrets." The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the gasps of those around them. Margaret's face had turned ash and her mouth opening and closing in shock, searching for words that wouldn't come. John looked stricken, his eyes darting to the floor, as though he could escape the humiliation searing through him. For a long, painful moment, no one moved. Eleanor felt the weight of their stares, the astonishment, the pity, the indignation, all directed at John and Margaret. She allowed herself a moment to absorb it all, to let her anger finally find release in the spectacle she had created, but she wasn't finished. "I want you to understand," she continued, her voice trembling with emotion, "that this isn't just about betrayal. This is about trust, loyalty, and respect, values that should be upheld in every marriage, in every friendship. You both stole those values from me. You took the life I believed in and turned it into a lie." Eleanor turned to the guests, her eyes brimming with sincerity. "I invited you all here tonight because you have been part of my life, part of our lives, and I wanted you to see that even the most familiar faces can hide unimaginable truths." The finality of her words hung in the air, and she saw John's eyes glisten with shame, Margaret's face etched with regret. Neither of them could look at her, and the silence between them was louder than any apology they could offer. As Eleanor set the letters down, she straightened her back, feeling a strange calm settle over her. She had reclaimed her story, her truth, and with it, a part of herself she had lost in the shadows of their lives. She gave a slight nod, signaling the end of her revelation, then turned and left the room, leaving John and Margaret standing amid a crowd of stunned onlookers, their reputations in tatters, the weight of their betrayal laid bare for all to see. Eleanor retreated to her bedroom, closing the door behind her as the murmurs and whispers continued to ripple through the house. She leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath, feeling a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Downstairs, she could hear the muted chaos unfolding, guests exchanging shocked glances, John trying to calm a panicked Margaret, his voice strained and desperate. She felt no pity for either of them. They had chosen their path, crafting lies and deception with careful precision, believing they could carry on their affair in the shadows without consequence. Tonight, Elena had simply turned on the lights. After a while, the guests began to leave, the sound of footsteps trailing out of the house. The murmurs grew quieter until the door finally closed, leaving a hollow silence in the space they had all occupied. The only voices left were those of John and Margaret, drifting faintly up the stairs. Eleanor didn't need to hear their words. She knew well enough that their illusions had shattered, that they were left with nothing but the wreckage they had created. Eventually, there was a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find John standing there, his face pale and worn, his eyes red-rimmed with remorse. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor met his gaze with a calm intensity, no longer feeling the anger that had once burned so fiercely. "Lena, he began, his voice faltering as he struggled to find the words. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry," she nodded, her expression unreadable. "Sorry isn't enough, John. You betrayed everything we built together. You lied to me, to our friends, to yourself. And now everyone knows what you've done. There's no taking that back." He looked down, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't think I don't know what I thought. That's the problem," Eleanor replied, her tone cold but steady. "You didn't think about anyone but yourself. You took my love, my trust, and treated it like it was disposable. And for what? A few stolen moments with someone who was supposed to be our friend." He opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. After a long pause, Eleanor stepped back, her voice firm. "You should leave, John. Whatever future we might have had is gone. And I don't want to share this house with someone who could do what you did." John's shoulders slumped, a look of defeat settling over him. "I understand," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll pack her back tonight." Eleanor watched as he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hall. She closed the door quietly, her heart aching but resolute. This was the only way forward. She knew that now. Staying with John would mean denying herself, staying trapped in the prison of his lies. As she stood there, Eleanor felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over her. The house was quiet, empty, the silence strangely comforting. She had confronted her pain, spoken her truth, and claimed her dignity. And now, she was finally free to let go of the life that had once defined her, to rebuild something entirely her own. That night, as Eleanor lay alone in her bed, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. Tomorrow would be the start of a new chapter, one not tainted by betrayal. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. The next morning, Eleanor woke to an unfamiliar quiet. John had left in the early hours, his departure as subdued as the remnants of their broken marriage. She walked through the house, feeling its emptiness in a way she hadn't before. Rooms that had once been filled with shared laughter and warmth now felt hollow, each corner echoing with memories she was struggling to release. In the kitchen, she noticed a note from John hastily scrawled and left on the counter. It read, "I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you find peace." She stared at it, unmoved. Words on paper meant nothing to her now. They were as empty as his apologies had been. She folded the note neatly, then slid it into the trash without a second glance. Eleanor spent the day trying to restore some sense of normalcy. She cleaned, organized, rearranged furniture, small tasks to fill the silence. But no matter how much she scrubbed, she couldn't rid herself of the lingering feeling of betrayal, a dark stain that clung to the edges of her mind. The house felt tainted, every room a reminder of the deception she had uncovered. That evening, she decided to visit Sarah, her closest friend. Sarah had been at the gathering, had witnessed the spectacle of John and Margaret's exposed affair. She knew the weight Eleanor carried. When Elena arrived, Sarah greeted her with open arms, pulling her into a comforting embrace. Sarah whispered, her voice filled with compassion, "How are you holding up?" Eleanor managed a small, wary smile. "One getting through it. One day at a time, I suppose." They settled into Sarah's cozy living room, sharing a bottle of wine as Eleanor recounted the events of the night before. Sarah listened quietly, nodding, a gaze filled with sympathy. When Eleanor finished, Sarah reached over, squeezing her hand. "You did the right thing," Sarah said softly. "You've been carrying this burden alone for too long. It's time to let it go, to take back your life." Eleanor nodded, feeling the truth of her friend's words. But as the evening wore on, an unsettling thought crept into her mind, a thought that had lingered, unspoken, since the moment she discovered the affair. Margaret's deathly silence during the confrontation, the shock that seemed almost theatrical. There was something about it that felt wrong, as though the deception ran deeper than she'd first realized. "Sarah," Eleanor began, her voice hesitant. Do you think there's more to this than what I saw? I can't shake the feeling that something darker lies beneath it all." It wasn't just an affair. It felt calculated. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, considering Eleanor's words. "What do you mean?" "I mean, they were so careful," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could I have missed it for so long, and the way they looked at each other? It wasn't just passion, it was almost as if they were plotting." The words lingered, casting a chill over the room. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't uncovered the whole truth, that perhaps she'd only reached the surface of something far more insidious. As she looked at her friend, Eleanor felt a dark resolve harden within her. If there was more to this betrayal, she would find it. She would dig as deeply as she needed to, no matter how painful. There were still secrets hidden in the shadows, and Eleanor was determined to bring them into the light. In the days that followed her conversation with Sarah, Eleanor couldn't escape the nagging feeling that John and Margaret's affair was only part of a larger scheme. The pieces didn't fit neatly. Something darker, something more calculated, seemed to lurk beneath the surface. The quiet of her house became oppressive, amplifying the whispers of doubt and suspicion that haunted her thoughts. Determined to uncover the truth, Eleanor returned to John's study, a place that now felt like enemy territory. She combed through his belongings with meticulous care, searching for anything that might explain the unsettling intuition gnawing at her. For hours she found nothing but mundane files, receipts, and scattered notes. She was beginning to feel foolish, doubting her own suspicions, until she stumbled upon a small, locked drawer hidden beneath stacks of old files. With growing resolve, Elena retrieved a paperclip and began picking the lock, a skill she'd never thought she'd need, but one that came in handy now. After a few tense moments, the lock gave way, and she opened the drawer to reveal a single leather-bound journal lying inside. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the weight of it heavy with unspoken secrets. Flipping through its pages, she was met with John's familiar handwriting, yet the entries told a story she could hardly believe. Page after page, she read details of meetings with Margaret, discussions about finances, and strange references to a plan they had devised. Her heart raced as she uncovered the full extent of their betrayal. A scheme not only to carry on their affair undetected, but to siphon money from accounts Eleanor had trusted John to manage. Worse still, Eleanor found notes that hinted at something even more insidious. Discussions about life insurance policies, vague references to ensuring her absence, and chilling remarks that made her blood run cold. They had planned for a future together that didn't include her, a future that relied on her being out of the picture entirely. The shock gave way to fury, as Eleanor realized the depth of their treachery. They had been willing to go to unimaginable lengths, not just to betray her love and trust, but to erase her completely from their lives. The affair had been more than a selfish fling. It was part of a calculated plan to strip her of everything she had built, to remove her from the life she had worked so hard to create. Eleanor's hands shook as she closed the journal, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge, of justice. The betrayal was no longer confined to her heart. It had poisoned her entire life. And now, knowing the full extent of their plot, Eleanor felt an unbreakable resolve harden within her. This wasn't over. They had sought to destroy her, to cast her aside without a second thought. But Eleanor wouldn't be the victim they had imagined. She would be the reckoning, the force that would ensure they faced the consequences of every lie, every scheme, every dark thought they had harbored. As she placed the journal back in the drawer, Elena knew what she had to do. She would confront them once again, but this time it would not be a confrontation of words. It would be a reckoning, a calculated response to their twisted plan. They had crafted their lies in the dark, but she would bring their secrets into the light in a way they would never forget. Eleanor spent the night piecing together her plan with the same precision John and Margaret had used to craft their betrayal. She felt strangely calm, each thought clear and deliberate. She knew now that justice was not only necessary but inevitable. They had turned her life into a cruel game, but Eleanor intended to finish it on her terms. The next morning she made a call to the authorities, reporting financial discrepancies in their accounts. Eleanor knew that the theft would raise suspicions and place John and Margaret under scrutiny, exposing the skeletons they had so carefully buried. She provided documents she'd found in John's study as evidence, her voice steady and sure, as she recounted each calculated transaction. But she didn't stop there. Eleanor contacted their lawyer, one who had worked with the family for years, arranging a meeting to update her will and protect her remaining assets. She shared the details of the life insurance policies and her suspicions about the threat posed to her safety, laying out a case that left no room for doubt. She had built her life alongside John, but now she was fortifying it against him. With these steps in motion, Eleanor arranged one final confrontation. She invited John and Margaret to the house that evening, presenting it as an attempt to discuss everything and bring closure. She anticipated their arrogance, their belief that she was too broken to retaliate. They accepted without hesitation, unaware of the reckoning awaiting them. As the evening arrived, Eleanor set the scene with the same care she had given the gathering that exposed their affair. The house was dimly lit, creating a tense atmosphere, every detail crafted to evoke the bitterness of betrayal. She waited in the living room, her demeanor calm and composed, her gaze steady. John and Margaret arrived together, their expressions guarded but smug, as if they expected to pacify her with a show of contrition. They sat across from her, the silence between them heavy and expectant. Eleanor began with a quiet intensity. "I invited you both here to make things perfectly clear. I know everything about the affair, the financial theft, the life insurance policies, your plan to erase me from this life." Her voice was unwavering, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. Their faces shifted from smug to stricken, panic flickering in their eyes, as the full scope of her knowledge registered. Margaret tried to speak, to stammer out an excuse, but Eleanor silenced her with a raised hand. "I trusted both of you," she continued, her voice laced with controlled fury. "You stole from me, plotted against me, and used my kindness against me. You thought I'd simply accept it, but you were wrong. I'm not the woman you thought I was." John's face turned pale, his voice barely a whisper. "Elena, please." We didn't mean for it to go this far. Elena's gaze was unyielding. You planned for it to go exactly this far. You were prepared to end my life if it meant getting what you wanted. But now you'll face the consequences. She stood, her posture commanding, each step calculated as she moved toward the door. I've reported everything, the theft, the policies, the lies. The authorities will be investigating, and your reputations, your lives, will crumble under the weight of your actions. You will lose everything, just as you intended for me. And then I walked to the door, opening it with finality. Now, leave my house. This is no longer your place, and I am no longer bound by the trust and loyalty I once gave you. I am free from you both. As John and Margaret stumbled to their feet, she held her ground, watching as they exited the home, their faces drained of color, their world collapsing around them. The door closed behind them with a satisfying click, and Eleanor was left alone in the quiet. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the weight of betrayal lift, replaced by a resolute peace. She had taken back her life, turned the darkness they had crafted into light. She walked through the house, each step grounded in newfound strength, knowing she had reclaimed her power, her dignity, and her freedom. Eleanor knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers, untainted, unbroken, a life rebuilt on her terms. In the days following her confrontation with John and Margaret, Eleanor felt the quiet strength of closure settle within her. The investigation she had set into motion quickly unearthed the tangled web of deceit and theft they had woven. The authorities discovered the extent of John and Margaret's financial manipulation, and with Eleanor's evidence, the case against them was undeniable. She watched from a distance as their lives crumbled, reputations shattered, and their circle of support vanished. The truth, once exposed, had a way of unraveling everything they had tried so desperately to conceal. Eleanor's friends and neighbors, who had witnessed the public fallout, rallied around her, offering their support and admiration for her courage. Some expressed shock, others sympathy, but all understood the strength it took for Eleanor to confront the betrayal head-on. She had turned her pain into power, and in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her life, but had shown others that they too could rise above their own hardships. One afternoon, she met with Sarah, her closest friend, who had been by her side through it all. She met with Sarah, her closest friend, who had been by her side through it all. They sat together in the same cave where Eleanor had first confided her suspicions. This time, however, Eleanor's eyes held a new light, a spark that had been absent for so long. I'm so proud of you, Eleanor, Sarah said, reaching across the table to take her hand. You took control of a situation that would have broken most people. You didn't let them destroy you. Eleanor smiled, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. I think I needed to be tested like this, to remind myself of who I am and what I'm capable of. They tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they only gave me back my freedom. The two friends toasted to new beginnings, Eleanor feeling the warmth of hope settle in her heart. She knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she was finally ready to embrace it, to build a life rooted in her own strength and resilience. She no longer needed validation from anyone else, and she had found a purpose and confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Over the next few months, Eleanor focused on rebuilding her life. She moved to a new home, filled with light and open spaces that felt like a fresh start. She began exploring passions she had long neglected: painting, travel, volunteer work, rediscovering the parts of herself that had laid dormant for so many years. One morning, standing by her new window as the sun rose, Eleanor felt a sense of peace and fulfillment that was entirely her own. The betrayal had left its scars, yes, but they were reminders of her journey, of her resilience. She had been tested, and she had risen stronger than before, and as she looked out onto her new life, Eleanor knew that she was finally, truly free. Free from lies, free from betrayal, and free to live the life she deserved, on her own terms, in her own light.